Today we're going to be talking about everyone's favorite Yu-Gi-Oh mechanic.
I hate pendulums.
YugiNoNo. Yesterday I briefly talked about pendulums and how they work, and how they might even come out on top even after Link Monsters come out, and even after all the rule changes. Granted, that is all just speculation, but I wanted to bring up the subject anyways, because pendulums are the most powerful mechanic to date, by far. But I also speculated as to if we are going to be even getting more pendulum decks in the future. Like, what if Konami just decides that pendulums are done and there's no need to explore that mechanic ever again? See, I personally liked pendulums a lot. Not for the reason that you think I do, though. I didn't just like pendulums for all the massive advantage that you gained, but I had fun playing the mechanic itself, especially not having to use up a normal summon, which allowed you to play some really killer side deck cards. Side Blocker is a fantastic example. Side Blocker is one of my favorite side deck cards of all time. But in this video, I want to talk about the pendulum mechanic more in depth, and talk about some of the potential that the mechanic had that was never really explored. So what makes Pendulum Monsters so good? Pendulum Monsters are half spells and half monsters that can be either put face up in the Pendulum Zone as a spell card, or normal or Pendulum summoned onto the field. A lot of you guys know this already, but let me explain this to the newer players. Pendulum Monsters and other monsters can be Pendulum summoned if you have the proper scales in the Pendulum Zones. And Pendulum Monsters, while face up in the Pendulum Zone as a spell card, act as the scales. And they also will have effects in the Pendulum Zone similar to like a field spell. So how you perform a Pendulum summon is by having, let's just say, a scale 2 in one zone and like a scale 8 in another zone. So you can Pendulum summon monsters, not just Pendulum Monsters, whose levels are between 3 and 7. Which brings me to point number 1 as to why pendulums are so good, is because you can Pendulum summon multiple monsters at once, and not just from your hand. Because Pendulum Monsters, instead of going to your graveyard, when they are destroyed, they go face up to your extra deck. And you can Pendulum summon as many face up Pendulum Monsters in your extra deck as you want. You can Pendulum summon 5 monsters from your extra deck. And all of this without even burning up your normal summon. So those are my second and third points here. The second point being all Pendulum Monsters inherently float, so they don't ever really die unless they're solemn warninged or striked or something. And the third point is, like I was explaining earlier, you don't use your normal summon, so it opens up your normal summon to be used for cards like Dinko Sekka, for example, that stop all of your opponent's back row. Which makes Dinko Sekka a fantastic side deck card in any Pendulum deck. You will see her like played in just about every Pendulum deck, really. So that is Pendulum summoning explained, without going into extra deck Pendulum monsters like Pendulum Fusions and Pendulum XC's monsters, for example. So now with all of that explained, I'm going to talk about some cooler things that I think should have been done and could have been done with the mechanic. And I think if certain changes were made, people would like it more. So Pendulum Monsters, while face up in the Pendulum Zones, can have some really broken effects, like Metal Foes, for example, popping, you know, another face up Pendulum scale, and then stacking that in the extra deck and setting a spell or trap from your deck. Or going back further, Luster Pendulum, for example, which pops your other Pendulum scale, stacks that in the extra deck, and then searches another copy of that same monster. Now, there were other cards like Monkey Board, for example, that had a Pendulum effect that searched, but for the most part, all Pendulums did was blow up scales and stack the extra deck and then Pendulum summon from the extra deck. That's really what every main Pendulum deck has done, except for Cleaforts. But Cleaforts were like the first good Pendulum deck, and it was more like an anti-meta deck, and I say that because it played like 3 Skill Drain and 3 Vanity's Emptiness and all that broken shit that was out at the time. But let's use the best Pendulum deck of all time as an example here, which was Pepe. Pepe would use Luster Pendulum to pop Plush Fire, and that was the main combo in the deck, and it made you go super plus, because Plush Fire summons from deck and Luster Pendulum searches on top of that. Pepe would make some broken, unbeatable boards, because the deck would consistently, and I mean consistently, get out Infinity, Felgrand, and Rafflesia, which was broken. So essentially you go first, you win, your opponent can't really play Yu-Gi-Oh! Which is why people didn't like pendulums, because they were just so powerful. And not only were they powerful, but they were really predictable. Like I said, pendulums never really did anything else but blow up scales and stack the extra deck. That's really what it did. That's the only thing it operated on. Now, there are a lot of Pendulum Monsters that have really cool and like quirky effects, like depending on the monster, like Mirror Conductor, for example, and several other Pendulum Monsters that like changed attack. Those were really cool ideas, but they were effectively like better field spells. And they were better field field spells because those field spells were not only scales, but monsters too. So Pendulum Monsters are also very powerful in that aspect, that they're three different things. Having a scale to Pendulum Summon, a field spell, and then a monster, which is a body, and not only a body, but those Pendulum Monsters will have effects on the field too. It's pretty dang good. But getting back on topic here, players did not like Pendulums because they were just leaps and bounds way more powerful than anything else, and Konami never really did anything exceptionally creative with them either. They made the mechanic more powerful, but they never really evolved what it could do. Let me give you some examples here of some decks that I thought would have been really cool Pendulum decks. The first idea is something that I came up with a long time ago, and some of you guys will remember that have watched my channel for a while. I always thought it would be really cool to have half ritual, half Pendulum monsters. And then of course act as Pendulum scales so you can Pendulum summon. I mean, in my head, the way that the card effects are, the mechanic is like not only really fun, but really powerful as well. And it would be really cool to have another competitive ritual deck that's not Necrons. Necrons is dead, it's over, it's on the ban list. We need some other competitive ritual deck. And I've started speculating on ritual Pendulums after the release of Spiritual Whisperer and that World Superstar set, because Spiritual Whisperer has a Manju effect when it's Pendulum summoned. So I was sitting there thinking like, whoa, what if they had half ritual, half Pendulum monsters, and then you have like this Manju when it's Pendulum summoned? Like, it all made sense. But sadly, even though in that card they may have hinted it, I doubt it, maybe I'm reaching here, but they never explored it, definitely. And something else that I really feel like they should have explored is like Pendulum fusions, because people love fusions. Like Fluffles are a fantastic example, Heroes is another fantastic example before Fluffles were even thought of, and having a Pendulum focused fusion deck that can not only get out really powerful half Pendulum, half fusion monsters, but have those monsters float back face up to the extra deck when they're destroyed, that concept right there is so good. And of course the fusion aspect with Pendulums would be very similar to synchro summoning, where if you synchro summon, the Pendulum monsters that you use for the synchro summon go face up to the extra deck. It'd be the same thing if you had Pendulum monsters on the field and you activate Polymerization, for example. Those monsters would go face up to the extra deck to be Pendulum summoned back out as well. So with Pendulums, I guess you can't really get over the stacking the extra deck aspect of it, but you can get over just like the pop and stack aspect. So Pendulums weren't my favorite mechanic by any means, but I did like them a lot. And I mean, even Pendulum decks that I played aren't my favorite decks of all time thinking back. But at the same time though, I did have a ton of fun playing those decks, so have many other people, and it would be a huge shame for Konami just to throw away all the potential that this mechanic has, especially after the new rule changes that are going to be taking effect, where the mechanic is more in check and less powerful. In other words, more fair and balanced in the game in general, which shouldn't dissuade them from making Pendulum decks in the future. But that's gonna do it for this video, guys. I would love to hear your thoughts about all this down in the comment section. And as always, be sure to dick slap that like button and subscribe.